new January 6th revelations, and the questions surrounding Russia's military.
And so we intend to find out what calls were made and piece together the truth.
Key records reveal a 7.5-hour gap in former President Trump's White House phone logs on January 6th.
The White House has decided not to assert executive privilege over the testimony of Jared Kushner.
Meanwhile, Trump's son-in-law and former White House advisor testifies before the House committee investigating the Capitol attack. Plus,
today I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months.
President Biden takes new steps to bring down U.S. gas prices. And Russian President Vladimir Putin drafts 135,000 Russians to join the military as his forces continue to pound Ukraine. Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by the estate of Arnold Adams, Koo and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. This week, there was so much news related to the January 6th investigation. The House committee is still trying to figure out what exactly former President Trump was doing when his supporters were storming the U.S. Capitol. And key documents revealed a nearly 8-hour gap in official White House phone logs from that day. Here's what Democrat Adam Schiff had to say about the mystery.
We're putting all the pieces together and exactly what was the president doing. And more importantly, as it would turn out, what was he failing to do during the time when the Capitol was under attack?
Meanwhile, Representative Liz Cheney, the Republican vice chair of the January 6th committee, emphasized the importance of the work lawmakers are doing.
If the country does not commit to investigating and pursuing accountability for those responsible, the court fears January 6th will repeat itself.
And on Thursday, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and former top White House advisor, testified before the committee for roughly 7 hours. It's still, though, unclear exactly what he said. Meanwhile, earlier this week, a federal judge said former President Trump, when trying to overturn the 2020 election, quote, more likely than not committed a felony. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Jacqueline Alemany. She's a congressional correspondent and author of the Washington Post newsletter, The Early 202. And here with me in studio, Jonathan Lemire, White House bureau chief for Politico and the host of Way Too Early for MSNBC, and Michael Shear, White House correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you all for being here. Jonathan, I want to start with you. There was so much news about these White House call logs, a big mystery here. What's the significance of these missing call logs, given the fact that there's still so much that lawmakers are trying to figure out about January 6th?
Obviously, the January 6th committee is trying to figure out exactly what the president was doing that day as his supporters were storming the Capitol. And we know from media reports, from accounts offered by lawmakers and aides, that he was working the phones for at least part of that day, that he had retreated for the most part. There's a private dining room just off the Oval Office. He's in there. There's a bank of televisions. He was watching what was going on and, per witnesses, seemingly pleased by a lot of what he saw. And we know he was making phone calls, but yet those calls aren't showing up in the logs. So that's raising a lot of questions. Now, we know, and Michael covered the Trump White House as well, that he was prone to using his personal cell phone. He was prone sometimes to using just whatever phone he can get his hands on, sometimes grabbing them from aides and asking, let me grab that. I'll use that for my whatever call I need to make right now. So the committee is certainly wondering what happened to those call logs. Is it simply a matter of the president wasn't using the official White House phones, wasn't using the White House switchboard, or did something else happen? Was someone perhaps trying to scrub the records to conceal what happened off the Oval Office that day.
And Michael, as Jonathan said, we all covered the Trump administration together, the wild ride that we took together. It could be easily explained that the president was just using cell phones, but there's also this idea that there is reporting in real time that lawmakers were trying to reach him, Kevin McCarthy and others, trying to get him to do something to stop his supporters from storming the Capitol.
Right, and I think one of the things that it underscores is just how difficult these investigations really are to conduct, right? On the surface, it might seem you interview a bunch of people who were there, you sort of, have subpoena power to bring them in and talk to you, and you lay it out. No, it's just not that easy. They've obviously run into legal roadblocks already, people like Steve Bannon and others who have said they won't talk to the committee. But in addition, you run into this kind of roadblock where, as Jonathan said, it's not exactly clear the cause of the missing time. Is it really that he didn't make a single call? I think a lot of us are pretty skeptical that given the reporting and the history, that he wouldn't have made any calls through the White House switchboard. But as Jonathan said, as you pointed out, like he it was a chaotic environment. That wasn't a disciplined administration. It wasn't a disciplined presidency. Who knows what went on in the dining room? And I think those are the difficulties that, as the committee and then obviously later the Justice Department are trying to piece together this puzzle. When you don't have a piece, it's difficult.
Well, Michael, I have you on because you so eloquently describe how the Trump White House operated. Jackie, I want to...
An understatement there.
Right, an understatement. Jackie, I want to bring you in. You've told our producers that you're focused on the chain of custody issues as well. What's your reporting reveal about what it means that we don't know so much about what the president was doing that day?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to phrase it as eloquently as Michael did, but this is, to be candid, a president who did not have much regard for the Presidential Records Act or for the processes that have been in place for decades now in the White House. As we reported a few months ago, this was a president who took 15 boxes of presidential records that should have been archived with the National Archival Records Administration to Mar-a-Lago that had to be confiscated and retrieved from his home a year after inauguration. So it is no surprise that he potentially was not following protocol on January 6th, but there are still so many unanswered questions here. There were various data streams in order to produce a presidential call log of that day. There's the White House switchboard report, there is the presidential diarist, there's also the staff secretary. So the questions are, who was actually recording the call log that day? Who did they share it with? Who presented it to the White House Office of Records Management, and all up and down, again, as you noted, the chain of custody. We need to know who these calls went through exactly. But, I did speak with a bunch of sources this week after our colleagues published these documents, who said that it certainly raised a lot of questions, that there wasn't necessarily a page break, but that there was one page that ended and another page that started and a lack of page numbers. Obviously, if there was a cover-up, that raises a lot of new legal avenues here, but that is something that we have not yet determined, and I think that the people involved with these processes as well are still trying to determine.
Well, Jackie, sticking with you, you talked about the different avenues. I wonder if you could also give us some insight into what's the information and documents that lawmakers are still wanting to get their hands on to try to get more insight into the January 6th investigation.
Well, as you can probably tell from watching this week closely, this has been a big week for the committee as they're trying to move quickly towards a month of public hearings in May. So basically they have 1 month left to wrap up their depositions and interviews. Yes, they've already conducted over 800 interviews with individuals and witnesses who had some role on January 6th or in the events leading up to the January 6th insurrection, but there are also a lot of big names that they have yet to tick off. People like Ivanka Trump, Scott Perry, Jim Jordan, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. They did get Jared Kushner to sit down today, but there are still some big people who were really close to the president and more specifically close to him on the actual day of January 6th. People like Peter Navarro and Dan Scavino, who were maybe the most intimately involved with some of the schemes to overthrow the results of the election, who have yet to cooperate. And so the committee at this point in time is really focused on trying to run as many of these loose ties down as possible before transitioning to the public phase.
And Jonathan, Jackie just really teed up my next question, which is about Jared Kushner. He wasn't in the country at the time, but we do know that Jared Kushner was such a close, I mean, you call him a close ally, but he was literally family. He's an in-law of the president working at the White House. Why is his testimony important? Why is hearing from him important if he wasn't actually at the White House on January 6th?
You're right. He was coming back from Saudi Arabia on January 6th. He never made it to the White House that day. And after the election, he pivoted largely to the administration's efforts in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, and so on. But he, of course, was still there. He is family, as you mentioned, married to Ivanka Trump, of course. He is at this point, the highest-ranking White House official to testify, and as well as the only member of the family so far to do so. And Democrats afterwards said he did so willingly. He said he was friendly and helpful. Now, we don't know yet much about what was said there, although I'll say willingly and helpful, not words we associate with the Trump administration so far with this committee. So that in itself is noteworthy. And even if he can't point to with firsthand witness accounts of what the president was doing that day, he certainly can talk to state of mind and the run-up to that moment. From Election Day on, we know he was there in the early morning hours of election night through the 6th and can testify the efforts the administration was making to overturn those results.
And Michael, all of this is happening, all these sort of new information. We had a judge this week say, as we noted, that President Trump more likely than not committed a felony. How does all of these new details ramp up pressure on the DOJ, on Attorney General Merrick Garland to be prosecuting President Trump or people around him, former President Trump or people around him?
Well, it definitely ramps up the pressure on the Attorney General, who the Justice Department has obviously gone after kind of the low-level folks, the people who were at the Capitol and actually stormed the Capitol. There's hundreds of prosecutions of those. But in terms of the planning, in terms of going after the people who are in the president's orbit and around the president, and obviously the president himself, that hasn't happened yet. There is a lot of real angst among the president's, President Biden's hardcore supporters who are like, look, this is why we elected you, to hold this man accountable, to hold the people around President Trump accountable. What's happening? Why is it taking so long? And so I think, the more that you have a judge saying that, he's concluded that the president might have committed felonies, the more you have information coming out from the committee that suggests that there's a real case there, the harder it is for Merrick Garland and President Biden, who, frankly, both of them, I think, in a perfect world, would like nothing to do with this, right? It's a hot potato. It's very political. President Biden obviously has his own agenda to pursue, and so it's a real political situation that I think in an ideal world they wouldn't want to deal with.
January 6th is a hot potato is another great Michael Scheer metaphor. I just have to note that. You're 2 for 2 now. Okay. Also on Friday, with all this news going on, President Biden announced that in March, the U.S. economy added 431,000 jobs.
More jobs created over the first 14 months of any presidency in any term ever. And more Americans get jobs as they do. It's going to help ease the supply pressures we've seen. And that's good news for fighting inflation.
With midterms approaching, a new NBC News poll shows that 38% of Americans blame the president for inflation, while just 6% blame Russia. This is, I think, in some ways, really, really interesting. Jackie, I want to come to you because I wonder what you make of the fact that the president and Democrats overall, they're trying to balance talking about the economy in a good way and taking the wins, while also trying to tell people we understand your struggle and we need to stay in power, so please vote for us in the midterms.
It is yet another hot potato, a dramatically different one for the Democrats, but one that they have been astutely aware of, especially congressional Democrats, as we've reported in the last few weeks. They had a strategy conference that was actually delayed because of some of these disagreements over the messaging. But this is what a lot of Democrats view as really the biggest barrier to the president's approval ratings. The fact that the administration and Democrats on the Hill can't come to some sort of cohesive messaging where they are able to strike this balance, able to, consistently let Americans know what they have done so far. They've passed a huge bipartisan infrastructure package. A lot of economists who believe that this is actually going to alleviate a lot of the inflationary pressures, but Americans are still waiting. And so it's up to Democrats and the president, first and foremost, to be able to communicate that exactly as you said. We feel your pain, but XYZ is coming down the line, and you're seeing them take measures day in and day out, most recently with regards to the oil reserves.
Well, the oil reserves is my next question. This is the biggest withdrawal in the strategic oil reserves more than 46-year history, Jonathan. The release would be 180 million barrels in total of oil. What's the White House thinking about this when you think about the fact that the president's taking this big step? But also, I wonder, what are they thinking in terms of the impact that this will have on not only on U.S. prices, but around the world, because this is focused on trying to make up for some of the Russian oil that's not going to be used.
This was simply about needing to do something. And the president yesterday, when he made this announcement, he was pretty candid and said that he wasn't sure when this would really impact the prices of the pump. He wasn't sure how much of a help this would actually be. It points to the political bind here. And every time we talk about gas prices, Democrats do, President Biden does, it's always Putin's price hike. They're trying to blame, of course, the Russian president and the invasion of Ukraine for the jump in prices. But of course, as polling suggests, this president is going to take a lot of the blame here. It's just the nature of he's at the helm. He's going to take the blame. The buck stops with him in the mind of American voters. So they are aware of this. And even though the president has received high marks from most foreign policy experts, some even Republicans, as to how he's handled the war in Ukraine, that hasn't trickled down to his poll numbers in the United States. They're still pretty low. And inflation seems to be, and pocketbook issues for Americans day to day, at least at this moment, seem to be the driving force, or will be the driving force for the midterms this year, and that's worrisome for Democrats. And the president is trying to get out ahead of this and show, look, I'm doing the best we can.
And I was talking to somebody at the White House today who said, look, there is some indication that American interest in the war overseas, which had peaked, obviously, with such an intense crisis. Now the war is sort of in this grinding phase where, the Ukrainians gain, the Russians gain, that there is going to be a waning of interest generally and a refocus on these pocketbook issues and inflation in particular. And I think the White House is well aware of that and determined to keep the president on message, doing things that the Americans can see him doing, at least so that they see that he's trying.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jackie, for joining us and for sharing your reporting. And as Michael was saying, there was all this news, of course, on the foreign front. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is entering its 6th week. There are reports that Russian soldiers are low on morale and weapons, and the Biden administration says Russian President Vladimir Putin is being misinformed about the state of his military by his closest advisors. Meanwhile, President Biden doubled down on the statement he made in Poland last weekend that President Putin, quote, cannot remain in power.
I was expressing my outrage at the behavior of this man. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. And it's more an aspiration than anything. He shouldn't be in power.
Joining the conversation, Nancy Youssef. She is a national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Nancy, thank you so much for being here. So Russian military officials this week said that they are regrouping. There was this big draft, but they're also still doubling down and pounding away at Ukraine. I wonder, what's the world learned this week in particular, maybe over the course of this war, about Russia's military capabilities?
It's a great question because here in week 5, we heard the Russians say during peace talks in Istanbul that they were prepared to draw down their forces in places like Kiev and Chernihiv in the north because they wanted to show good faith effort towards a peace deal. But what we saw on the ground was a Russian force that was in fact repositioning its forces. These forces weren't going home. They were going to other places, particularly in eastern Ukraine, trying to learn and regroup from the losses of the first 5 weeks, logistical challenges they've had, the inability to hold territory. And I think what we saw from the Russians is while they said they were withdrawing, they continued striking places like Kiev with airstrikes. Rather than trying to get out of the war, I think we saw Russia trying to get itself in position to redefine success as not taking the whole country, but the eastern part of the country, and putting its forces in a better position to do that after a lot of mistakes in the first 5 weeks of this war.
And Jonathan, there was also this news that Russia accused Ukraine of launching a helicopter attack on a fuel depot on Russian soil. Now, Ukraine is saying that's not true, that they did not do that. But I wonder how concerning this development is when you think about the fact that there are these peace talks going on, and some are worried that Russia is sort of trying to use false flags to get ready to inflict even more more pain on people.
From the first hours of this war, U.S. officials and their Western allies have warned about exactly this, that Russia might stage a false flag attack, blame it on Ukraine, or in some scenarios, perhaps a NATO ally, and use that as an excuse to escalate the violence. And certainly Biden administration officials that we've talked to all week long, and we've heard from the president himself, are very skeptical about Moscow's good faith efforts to have any kind of peace talks right now, any sort of ceasefire agreement. Though some troops today, it seems like Russian troops have indeed pulled away from Kyiv, but as just said, they're not going home. They're just heading to other regions, and they're still continuing the long-range bombardments of Kyiv and other cities. So it's not like peace has come to those areas. And it does seem like Putin is trying to capture the eastern, the Donbass region, where there's Kremlin-backed separatist movements, perhaps to then strengthen his hand at the negotiating table down the road. It's clear their initial strategy of a lightning strike to take down the country, that didn't happen. So now Putin, with pressure at home, pressure from economic sanctions, may be shifting his goals, but there's no sign this war is going to end anytime soon.
And Nancy, I want to come back to you. What's the Pentagon's view of how Russia could use these peace talks to gain an advantage militarily?
I think their fear is that the Russians are signaling in places like Istanbul that they want to enter a peace deal, but in fact exploiting the talks as a way to reposition their forces such that they can make gains not only for the Donbass in the short term, but potentially go after places like Kiev again. And so I think their concern is that you could see Russia actually maneuver towards these key points of the country again and not enter a peace deal. I think the other concern that they have is that as Russia has suffered these losses, and they have been surprising and humiliating in many cases, that Russia will use more escalatory attacks to gain ground in the absence of a strong ground force, a joint effort by its Navy and Air Force to strike in Ukraine, and that there are fears that down the road we could see chemical attacks or other weapons of mass destruction in a bid by Russia to regain ground in the absence of being able to do it on according to its original military planning.
And Nancy, sticking with you, there was a virtual call between President Biden and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. I wonder, has there been any sort of evolution on what the U.S. and the West are willing to do for Ukraine as this war drags on? Or is it sort of tension continuing to grow among this leader and what sort of Ukraine wants versus what they're going to get?
I think it's the latter, that there continues to be tension, because the U.S. has said that this is a fight for democracy and yet has been unwilling to needs to actually prevail. The U.S. has instead sent a lot of defensive weapons, Stingers, and other defensive weapons in a bid to help Ukraine, but not enough to let them prevail. The U.S. concern is that if they send offensive weapons, this will be seen as a escalation by the United States towards Russia and potentially expand the war. The challenge is that you see a Ukrainian force that has been far more successful than many anticipated, has made territorial grounds, even though they've had a disadvantage in terms of the types of weapons, the number of forces. And so the Ukrainian request is, if the West sees this as a threat to democracy, then the West should be providing every weapon possible to help them prevail in this war. What we're seeing from both Russia and Ukraine this week in particular is that for all their talks during the peace talks in Istanbul, I think both sides continue to believe that they can prevail in this war. And I think what you heard from President Zelensky was a plea to the United States to help him achieve that goal.
Michael, I want to turn to a subject that's related, but also just we're almost getting pulled back into the Trump years. President Trump this week called on Vladimir Putin to find alleged sort of dirt, essentially, on Hunter Biden, President Biden's son. What's that say about the politics of all of this? We're talking about sort of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, but there's also the domestic politics and the former president continuing to swirl around here.
Well, that's true. I think that what the former president's antics, I guess you might call it, bringing this kind of stuff up and talking to Vladimir Putin, via social media, whatever, it underscores a problem for the Republican Party, right? The traditional Republican Party pre-Trump was, very strong on Russia. I mean, it prided itself on taking a strong stand against Russia and Russian aggression. And now they've got, they spent 4 years with Donald Trump, essentially coddling up to him. And so now you have a problem for Republicans who have to, kind of campaign in a setting where they've got the former president, not being on message, essentially.
Well, it's remarkable and something that we're going to have to, of course, keep watching because President Biden himself said that other countries are wondering, is former President Trump going to be back anytime soon? So much to talk about. Thank you so much to Nancy, Jonathan, and Michael for sharing your reporting and joining us. We'll continue our conversation on the Washington Week Extra. This week's topic, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which was signed into law. Find it on our website, Facebook, and YouTube. And tune in tomorrow to the launch of PBS News Weekend with Jeff Bennett. Every weekend, that program will bring you the latest news on politics, culture, and much more. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Yami Shalsendor. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by the estate of Arnold Adams, Koo and Patricia Ewens with the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities, Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.
Good evening and welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. On Tuesday, President Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act into law. For the first time in U.S. history, the law makes lynching a federal hate crime.
The law is not just about the past, it's about the present and our future as well. Hate never goes away, it only hides. It hides under the rocks. Given just a little bit of oxygen, it comes roaring back out, screaming. But what stops it is all of us, not a few. All of us have to stop it.
The bill is named after Emmett Till. He was a 14-year-old black boy who was brutally murdered by a group of white men in Mississippi in 1955. His mother's courageous decision to have an open casket funeral for him made a huge impact on the fight for civil rights because people got to see, of course, up close the impact of that murder. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Trymaine Lee. He is a correspondent for MSNBC and the host of the Into America podcast. And back with me still is Michael Shear, White House correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you both of you for being here. Trymaine, I want to start with you. We talked a little bit about who Emmett Till was, but you talked to his family. Tell us a little bit more about who Emmett Till was and why it's so important that this bill was named after him.
Yeah, Mish, the name Emmett Till is kind of seared in our collective memory, at least in our community, as an unwilling martyr, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago visiting family in Mississippi when he made the mistake of whistling at a white woman. And that ended up getting him killed. But not just killed, he was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, right? His deaths really sparked the modern day civil rights movement. And so all these years later, 65 years later, even though his name rings clear, right, rings loud, we understand who Emmett Till was, his name being on this legislation means that the justice that he didn't get in life, no one was ever held accountable for his murder, that perhaps moving in the future, that people will be able to be held accountable under this law, right? So his name, Emmett Till, we know, but now it will be emblazoned forever in this legislation, and hopefully moving forward, it'll stand for justice, not just the manner in which he died.
And you talked to a member of Emmett Till's family for your upcoming podcast. I can't wait to listen to that episode. What's your biggest takeaway from that conversation? What sticks with you?
Yeah, I spoke to the Reverend Wheeler Parker, who was an older cousin of Emmett Till's, who was actually there the night he was kidnapped. And I think the first thing that stands out to me is that when we think about the so-called bad old days when black folks were being lynched across this country with impunity, it seems like some distant memory. But there are people living with us today who have family members who were lynched, who were witnesses of lynching. And so I think the idea that the gap between now and then is much smaller than we can imagine, but also the pain still being carried by this family all of these years later, to hear the pain in his voice still and look in his eyes and to hear him tell the story about Emmett Till's kidnapping and murder, it just gives you a heavy heart.
It's a heavy heart. It's absolutely a heavy heart. And Trymaine, one more question for you, because this bill comes after 100 years of trying, 200 failed attempts. What do you think made this moment different and made this bill be able to be passed?
I think you have a number of things. I don't think it's lost on anyone that Joe Biden is thinking about history. When he said that he'd have the backs of black folks, many people across the country are waiting for those signs. But I think Ketanji Brown Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court, tapping Kamala Harris, I think this is another one of those signposts that Joe Biden is trying to make his mark on history. But certainly the tenor and tone of the last several years in this country and the racial reckoning and arriving at this moment now where the soil is ripe for change, right? People have a dialogue and a language around some of these racial disparities. I think after 200 failed attempts, we arrive at this moment. But I think it only took 200 because of the white supremacy still baked into our politics, right? To a vote for this bill many years ago, would have been undermining the white supremacist impulses of a lot of people across this country, especially those in the South. So we arrived at this moment after 200 attempts in 100 years. I think it's certainly a sign of progress in this country.
Michael, jump in here. You were nodding both when Trymaine was talking about sort of the impact of this, but also the political calculations, the political decisions being made by the White House.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. with the question of Biden and his legacy. I mean, the president came in to office absolutely determined to be to be a leader on some of these issues. He's talked about equity from the beginning. Obviously, the decisions that have already been mentioned about selecting the first African American, vice president, et cetera. I guess I would offer a little bit of cynicism, though. I mean, I'm a reporter. That's what I do. In some ways, I think there is so much work to be done on other issues that really, truly are central to to Black life in America, whether it be voting rights, whether it be prison reform, sentencing reform. And I wonder if in some ways this wasn't a sort of easier vote for people to take, right? I mean, I think only 3 members of the House voted against it. I think it was a kind of nobody objected in the Senate to it. And so, I mean, that speaks in part to all of the things that were said about the moment that we're in, but it also may speak to a way in which this was kind of more of a symbolic vote. And really, I think the test is still in the future. Look at all of the things that, for example, the Republican Party hasn't been willing to let through that benefit the country, but also in particular the black community that speaks to how far we have yet to go. This is one piece of legislation. I think folks are happy that it's that it's done, but there's a lot left.
Well, speaking with you, Michael, there is this sense when I talk to White House officials that they realize that they're going to be called to account to say, okay, what laws, what did you pass specifically to improve life for Black people who you're going to need to turn out in record numbers, not only to keep your job in 2024, President Biden, but also to win in 2022 in these midterms. What's your sense when you talk to White House officials about how concerned they are about voting rights and policing and just the ability to make the case to Black people to turn out in big numbers?
Look, I mean, I think it depends whether you're talking to them on the record or off the record, right?
We want the off the record stuff.
Right. I mean, on the record, they will cite a litany of things that that are part of the president's record to date, and I think they will say that they believe that the president and his party should get credit for taking those steps. I think privately there is concern that the gridlock in Washington has meant that on some big things that are important to the Black community, and there are issues that cross over, right? For example, college affordability is an issue that is broader than the Black community, but often hits the Black community particularly hard, and they haven't made any progress on that. On a lot of the issues that they failed to do on the his Build Back Better agenda, those are things I think privately that they worry that they're going to come to the midterm elections and then the 2024 reelect and not have a lot to show for it, and that the Black community will hold them accountable.
Yeah. And Tremaine, in thinking about sort of the current day issues that are going on, there's some that are going to wonder, why do you even need an anti-lynching bill in 2022? But then, of course, we have the case of Ahmaud Arbery and so many others that show that this lynching is not something that is in the past, it's something that could happen to people right now.
That's right. Well, first of all, I think people, when you think of lynching, you think a noose and a tree, right? But the organized murder based on hate, right? That's the lynching. And what this bill does, it expands the net of who can be held accountable for the conspiracy. In the case of Emmett Till, whistling at the white woman gins up her brother and her family members, and she's central to this. And so, in a current context, she would also be charged with murder. But when we see the level of hate and racism and white supremacy still coursing through the fabric of this country, there should be no surprise or concern why we still need an anti-lynching law. It's not just the grainy black and white photos, that strange fruit, right? Strange fruit has taken many different forms today. We see it in the systemic kind of violence, but in certainly still the physical violence we see in a case like Ahmaud Arbery.
And sticking with this idea of strange fruit and what people are enduring, what do civil rights activists tell you that they hope this bill will change in this nation's mind? Because I was looking at some of the interview that you did with Emmett Till's family member, and they talked about the fact that you can legislate on paper, but that you also can't really change, in some ways at least, you can't change people's hearts and the way that people view other people.
I think our colleague said it well a few minutes ago. This is largely symbolic, and that's what I meant when I said that it's not lost on Joe Biden. History is not lost on him, and so by putting this mark, you're going to see this in the history book. It's a good faith show that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is, symbolically at least. But I don't think it's lost on any of the activists across this country who I've talked to, who say that there is a need for a substantive reform in this country, but that the baseline in America is anti-blackness. There's a certain level of suffering or hurt or disenfranchisement or caging in jails or shooting by police or all kinds of forms of violence heaped on the community that is accepted in this country. And so the same way that Ketanji Brown Jackson is actually progress and it looks great, will that substantively change the lives of Black folks? Having a VP Kamala Harris, will that substantively change? Unless you get some teeth behind legislation around protecting the franchise for folks and so many other issues across this country, it'll be a nice little sign to hang on your legacy, but little more.
Yeah, those are all key questions, Tremaine. Sort of what is going to be the actual impact of what could be the symbolism of all sorts of things. Even some would say the first Black president, the first Black VP, the first Supreme Court nominee. All that is great, but it needs to also be tied with the idea that everyday African Americans need to be able to live and flourish in their communities without being scared of being racially profiled. So much we could talk about. I'll have to leave it there tonight, but thank you so much to Tremaine and to Michael for sharing your reporting and for joining us. And I'm Yamiche Alcindor, of course. Good night from Washington.